14. John chapter 6, verse 1 says this, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles, which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company coming to him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And he said, and this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise the fishes as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remained, that nothing be lost. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I want for you tonight to move my heart. Father, I want to feel your presence. I want to feel your spirit. And I want that for every person that's here. Father, I can't preach any great sermon. I can't deliver any great truth. But I want to try to endeavor to bring across the little thought that you've given to me out of this passage. Father, I pray that you'd meet with us. Pray, Father, that you'd be with those that are here, those that can't be here. Pray, Father, that someone is helped. Father, I hope that everyone would be helped. Father, we ask that you would bless this service. Bless us with your presence. We pray, please, for Jesus' sake. Amen. This, I think, is one of the most amazing and mind-boggling miracles that Jesus did. He did some amazing miracles, but this one is way up there on the list in my book of things that Jesus did. We often read this passage of Scripture, and if you're like me, then you think to yourself, understanding and realizing the miracle that he did, that he took this small amount of food and fed 5,000 men. Now, I don't know if there were men, women, and children there. If there were men and women and each man had a wife, that would have been 10,000. If there were men, women, and children there and each husband had a wife, each man had a wife, and each husband and wife had a child, then that would have been 15,000 people. And he took this little bit of food and he multiplied it and fed all of those people. That's just amazing. That's just mind-boggling. If you're like I am, then you look at that and you think to yourself, knowing what life is about, knowing the reality of life, knowing what it's like to work and try and make a little paycheck stretch to the end of the month, and often there's more month than there is check to go with the month. It's just mind-boggling. You think to yourself, how did he do it? How did he do it? But that's not what I want to preach about tonight. There's a sermon in the multiplication that Christ did. I'm thinking about preaching a sermon someday on God's math. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. I'm thinking about preaching on that. Matt's ears are perking up right now. He's thinking, oh, a sermon on math. I like a sermon on math. But I don't want to preach about the multiplication of the food and the feeding of the 15,000. There's a sermon in that, but that's not what I want to preach about tonight. You think of all the people that was there, all of the needs that was there, all of the ones that gathered together, and there'd be a great sermon in that. The multitude that came, there would be a great sermon in that, but that's not what I want to preach about tonight. What I want to preach about tonight is found in verse 14, and it's just a little sentence that we find that Jesus spoke. If you have a red letter edition of the Bible, every person don't have a red letter edition of the Bible. Every Bible is not a red letter edition, but you'll notice that if you have a red letter edition, that those words are in red, those that Jesus spoke, because those are the ones that he said. And it says this, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. A fragment is the smallest part that's broken off of the whole unit. You have the whole unit, and there's a little piece, there's a little part. It's still the same thing if you have a whole piece of fish and you break off just a little piece of the fish, then that's a fragment. Just a little part of the original unit. It's not as big or as great or as grand as what you started out with, but it's still the same thing, but it's just a small part of it. It's broken off. Often people look at things that are broken off or things that are broken and see no value, see no use in them. Look, if you will, at the words in red and notice what Christ says. Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. I wanted to preach to you tonight about this thought, the broken pieces. The broken pieces. God is willing to provide. He wants to provide, and He can provide. You never have to wonder in your heart or your mind as you go through life, can God? Because I say to you tonight that God can. God can provide. And you find here that it doesn't matter whether it was 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000. When God said sit down, and when He took the fish and the loaves and gave to the disciples, and the disciples distributed to the people, it had to work because He is the provision for life. And when He said do it, it would be done because His word can never fail. So there's always enough. But there wasn't just enough. There wasn't just barely enough. There wasn't just barely enough down to the last little piece and someone ate it and there was nothing left. See, Jesus prepares meals like I like. He prepares meals like I like. A story is told of a preacher that went to a meeting and the pastor introduced him to one of the ladies in the church and said, Brother Smith, you're going to be dining at this lady's house this afternoon. And he said, oh, wonderful, wonderful. Said, ma'am, would you like to know what I like? And she said, oh, yes. I've been worried about this all week. I thought I may fix something you don't like or something you don't have a taste for or something you don't care for. And I worried about this all week. What should I fix for the preacher? What should I fix for the preacher? And he said, ma'am, there's only one thing I like. Only one thing. And her heart sank. She thought, oh no, there's only one thing. What if it's not what I have to prepare, what I intended to prepare? He said, there's only one thing I like. And she said, what is that? He said, plenty. Plenty. I say to you tonight that Jesus prepares meals like I like. There wasn't just barely enough. There wasn't just enough, and that's all there was. Every morsel and every crumb and every piece wasn't eaten. There was some left over. They eat their fill. They eat until they couldn't eat no more, and there was some left over. The fragments, the pieces. Now, we would look at the fragments, we would look at the pieces, and we would say, oh, it's not enough to save. It doesn't make any difference. It's over. The meal is done. There's no sense in saving that. Often at my house, my wife fixes meals like that too. She's done that for years. She fixes enough to feed Colonel Cox's army, but she'll have a little bit of this or a little bit of that left over. Maybe it's a little bit of pea salad. Maybe it's a little bit of mashed potatoes. Maybe it's a little bit of gravy, and I'll say to her, you want to put this in a bowl and put it in the refrigerator. And I've heard her say often over the years that it's not enough to keep. Just go ahead and throw it out. We would put it in a bucket and take it out and feed it to the dog, or we would throw it in the trash, or we would put it in the slop bucket to feed the hogs with. We wouldn't really find any value in it. We wouldn't really see anything that's noticeable in it. But one of the first things that I notice in this passage of Scripture is that God noticed the fragments. God looked out and He saw the people, but not only did He see the people, He saw the people filled, and not only did He see the people filled, but He saw that there was some left. There was some left over. Now, He didn't say to the disciples, go gather up the fragments, I think, because He wanted to just clean up after everybody was there. And I'm sure there was lots of mess to clean up. I'm sure that every person that left a piece of bread behind or a piece of fish behind, and if you got 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000 people on the hillside in the grass, it would have been a mess. It would have been lots to clean up. But I don't think He told the disciples, go and gather it up and clean up and tidy up just because He wanted to gather it up so He could throw it away. I think He noticed the fragments for a reason. I think He noticed the fragments for a reason. Because He says this, He says, gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. He had a plan for these fragments. He had a purpose for these fragments. I don't know what he did with those fragments after he gathered them. The Bible doesn't tell us what he did, but he noticed the fragments. And he said, I see those pieces that are broken off, those pieces that are just fragments, those pieces that someone else might not see any value in. I noticed them. God's thoughts are not like our thoughts. We would say, well, just throw it away. Just gather it up, clean everything up, neaten everything up, tidy everything up, put it in some baskets, send it to the local farmer, let him feed it to the pigs. But God doesn't work in big or small. He doesn't work in great or grand. He works in all and all. See, it's all important to God. Big, small, it's all important to God. It doesn't matter if you have $10,000 or 2 little mites, like the woman that cast her money into the treasury, 2 little mites. Yet he said to the disciples, she's given more than everybody I've seen give today, because she gave out of necessity. She gave what she needed, yet she sacrificed and gave it to me anyway. I heard a story one time about a man that said he had $100 in his wallet, went to listen to a man preach, and God said to him, so I want you to give that man that $100. And he said, God, that's the only $100 I have. I need to get back home and I'll need money. And he said, I want you to give that $100. So he wrestled with it. Finally, he gave the money. He got out to the car and said, well, there's a fine. How do you do? God said, now I got to get home and I don't know if I have enough gas. Went down to the gas station and started to stick the pump in the car. A man walked up to him and said, God told me to buy you a tank of gas. Now, he would have missed that blessing had he not done what God told him to do. God works in all and all. God takes care of all. God cares about all. Romans 10:12 says this, for there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call on him. So he's not just the God of the Jew. He's not just the God of the Greek. He's not just the God of the big or the great. He's not just the God of the great evangelists or preachers or pastors of the day. It's not about whether the church has $500,000 in the bank or 50 cents in the bank. He's Lord over all. He's Lord over all. He cared about these fragments that were left over. You know, in life, often people reach a place where it seems like there's a breaking, there's a piece, there's a shattering, there's something that happens in life, and maybe you can relate to that idea, a fragment. Sometimes life is fragmented. Sometimes people's hearts are fragmented. Sometimes people are broken. Sometimes people come to a place where they sit down and say, God, everything is falling apart. We often preach about him and talk about him and use him as an illustration, but I don't know of a greater illustration to use than the life of Job. Job had much. Job was blessed. Job was increased by God. Job was one of the richest men and one of the most wise men of his time. He had servants, he had sheep, he had camels, he had everything that you can imagine. He had houses and lands and wealth and health, and everything was going for Job. Until the day that God pointed Job out to Satan. Satan didn't bring up Job's name. God brought up Job's name. And he said to Satan, Satan, where are you coming from? He came and presented himself to God. He said, Satan, where are you coming from? He said, from in the earth, walking up and down in it, going to and fro. Later we're told in Peter what he was doing while he was walking up and to and fro, seeking whom he may devour. But God says to him, have you noticed Job? Have you seen Job in all your wanderings and crossing through life and going up and down valleys and mountains? You ever thought about or bumped into or run into this man named Job? Satan knew who Job was. Satan, I think, wanted Job, longed for Job, lusted to have Job that he might devour him. He said, but God, you put a hedge about him. Thank God that he puts a hedge about us. Thank God that he puts a hedge about families and homes and lives. But he said, if you take down that hedge and take your finger and stick it in his life and crush him, he'll curse you to his face. He said, no, I won't do that. I won't do that. I won't break him. I won't crush him. I won't destroy him. I'll take the hedge down. He took the hedge down and Satan attacked him. And Satan took away everything that he could possibly take, and he had to stop short from Job's life because God said, you can't take his life. But it's amazing what a man can suffer and go through and still live. And he suffered and suffered and suffered. His friends came to him and accused him of being wicked. He said, you're miserable comforters. He had no camels. He had no cattle. He had no children left. He had no family left. He had no lands left. All he had left was a place where he had burned something. He crawled into the place where he had burned something, took a piece of a broken pot, sat down and longed for the day that he could die. He cursed the day he was born. He cursed everything about his life, but he didn't curse God. And he sat there in destitution. He had nothing. I say to you tonight that if that's not a man that's broken, I don't know what is. If that's not a piece, if that's not a fragment, then I don't know what is. Job was a fragment when he's sitting in the ashes, scraping himself, wishing that he could die. There's a story in the New Testament about a man that goes down to take a journey, and he goes from one place to another place, and while he's on his way in the journey, he falls among thieves, and the thieves strip him of his clothes and beat him and rob him and leave him in the ditch for dead. Leave him in the ditch for dead. A priest passes by. A priest passes by, sees the man, and leaves him there, broken, fragmented. Then a Levite passes by, sees the man, notices the man, looks on the man, understands that the man is broken and beaten and bleeding, and passes by on the other side. They walked off from the fragmented man. That's a broken man. Moses killed a man and then went to the backside of the desert and hid himself for years. Jesus Christ, I think, God comes to him, shows him a bush that burns and is not consumed, yet Moses is there on the backside of the desert. I think Moses was fragmented. I think Moses was just a piece at that time. The Apostle Paul took religion, and religion will send people to hell faster than anything else because it looks so much like the truth. It looks like it's real. It looks like it's right. It looks like it's a good way. It makes sense. People understand it, but religion is not necessarily salvation. And salvation is not necessarily religion. But pure religion and undefiled before God, the Bible tells us, is to care about people, widows and fatherless, to have the love of Christ in your heart. But the Apostle Paul took religion. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was separated to the straightest sect of people of his day. He walked the straightest and jumped the furthest. He had the broad-bordered garments and the phylacteries and everything that went along with it. He had all the trappings of religion. Yet he stoned Christians. He dragged them off to court to have them killed. On the Damascus Road, Paul finally realized that he was just a fragment. He was broken when God called him to preach. Joseph was one of 12 brothers. And Joseph was hated by his brothers. His brothers was jealous of him. His brothers didn't like him. He was the pet of their father. Don't ever have favorites with your children. Don't ever have favorites with your children. But he was his daddy's favorite. His daddy made him a special coat, and he pounced around in it and flounced around in it. And you say, Brother Gary, how do you know he did that? Because I live in a real life. That's what I would have done. If my mother would have given me a special coat, I would have told my brother, look at this coat that Mom gave me. I had an uncle one time that liked me and loved me and cared about me, and he sent me a gift. It was a nice cowboy hat. Nice cowboy hat. All I needed was a 6-gun to be a real cowboy and a long coat so I could throw the thing back like that. Reach for the sky. Had this nice cowboy hat. And he sent it to me. My brother was 4 years older than me, and I guess he got jealous over that hat. And I used to tell him, look at my hat. You like my hat? That's what I'd say to him. Look at my hat. It's that feather in that hat. Uncle Cash got me that. Uncle Cash got me that. He got tired of it one day, and he snatched the hat off my head and tore it into a million smithereens. I was never so broken in my entire life. You say, how do you know that Joseph done that? Because I know what it's like to be a brother and what it's like to be favored a little bit. But they found him and they caught him and they captured him and they put him in a pit and they sold him into bondage. And there's Joseph down there in the land of Egypt, sitting in prison, wondering where God is. And he was a fragment. Here's a fragment. But I want to say to you that God noticed Job. God noticed the man that was broken on the side of the road. God noticed Moses. God noticed Paul. God noticed Joseph. You never get so far broken in life that God doesn't see you where you are. He notices. You wonder if anyone notices. Does anyone see me? Where's God? Where's God? Has God abandoned me? God noticed the fragments. Secondly, God cared about the fragments. How miserable it is to go through life and wonder if anybody cares. How miserable it is to go through life and wonder if anybody cares. If there's one thing that I want for this church, it's not that we have great big buildings or big fancy pews or chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. It's not that we have any great material wealth. But one thing that I would want for this church is that people would come here and be able to say, I'll tell you one thing about those folks at Mountain Valley Missionary Baptist Church, they care. They care. It makes a difference in their life. They care. I hope that we always care about people. How miserable it is to wonder if anybody cares. And how blessed it is to know that somebody cares. To know that you're in someone's thoughts. To know that you mean something to someone. Jesus saw the fragments. Jesus cared about the fragments. He didn't just see the fragments and say, what a mess, gather this up and throw it away. He cared about the fragments. He said, gather them up. I want you to collect them. I want you to make sure that you preserve them. I have a reason and a plan and a purpose for them. He said, I don't want any of them to be lost. He cared about the fragments. Jesus tells the disciples, take time, take effort, take energy, spend time and effort and energy on these little fragments. Now, if it would have been me, I would have thought to myself, that one don't matter, I won't pick it up. That one don't matter, I won't pick it up. I think Jesus was there supervising this whole operation and said, don't leave that one, pick it up too. Don't leave that one, pick it up too. And I think he made sure that they collected every fragment. Let me say to you tonight that if you feel like you're in this place in life where you're broken, you're a fragment, that Jesus cares. Jesus tells the disciples to take time, effort, and energy to gather these fragments. Why? Why would he gather these fragments? These little pieces that seemingly wasn't important, seemingly wouldn't have been significant to anybody or anyone. I mean, why does it matter to gather up those pieces? Because it mattered to him. It mattered to him. Why would Jesus stop to talk to a little woman with an issue of blood who had nothing? She had nothing she could offer him. She had nothing she could give him. She had no money. The Bible tells us that in all of her years in struggling and trying to be healed of this issue of blood, she'd spent everything she had on physicians. And now she's a widow with nothing. With nothing. But she hears about this Jesus of Nazareth, this one that had opened the blind eyes and unstopped the deaf ears, the one that had straightened lame legs. And she come to him and said, I don't have to see him face to face. He doesn't have to take out his anointing oil and touch me on the forehead. He doesn't have to touch my hand. All I have to do is get close enough to touch the hem of his garment, and I believe I'll be healed. Why would Jesus take time to spend time on this woman that had nothing that she could offer him? Why would he take time? Why would Jesus stop a funeral procession one day in the city of Nain to comfort the heart of a widow that was burying her only son? And she's going along behind the funeral procession, the funeral bearer that the Bible talks about, and he stops the funeral procession and he looks at the woman and he says, don't weep, don't weep. He goes over and he lays his hand on the coffin and he says to the young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he sits up and talks to his mother. Why would he care about a widow that doesn't have anything? Why would he care? Why would he have a blind beggar in Jericho brought to him that's crying on the side of the road? Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And the more they tried to quiet him, the more they told him, shh, be quiet. Be quiet. You're making a ruckus. You're making too much noise. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing us. Shh, be quiet. The more they tried to hush him, the more he cried out. And Jesus had him brought to him that he might receive healing because he cares about the fragments. He cares about the fragments. John chapter 10 says that the hireling cares not for the sheep, There's a group of men, I believe, in the United States of America and maybe abroad in the world today that are what you'd call hirelings. They're in the ministry, they preach messages, they write books, they do all the things that are supposed to be done by men that are in the ministry, but the Bible calls them hirelings. Hirelings. They do it for the package. They do it for the money. They do it for the notoriety. They do it for the prestige. They do it so that they may be seen of men, but in their heart, they don't care for the people that they minister to. It's sad to say, but I believe that there's some like that in the world today. Jesus calls them hirelings. They're just paid to watch the sheep. They're like men that are paid to go out and watch the shepherd's flock. But see, they weren't the one that was there when that sheep was born. They weren't the ones that led them out and watered them and beat the wolves off of them. The shepherd did that. But the shepherd now has to hire somebody to watch the flock for whatever reason. And he hires these men and they do their job mostly. But when danger comes, when turmoil comes, when trouble comes, when the wolf comes for the sheep, they flee because they don't truly care for the sheep. Jesus said, I'm not like that. I'm not a hireling. I didn't come because I'm paid to come. I didn't come because someone made me come. I didn't come because someone told me it's my responsibility or my job. I came because I loved. I came because I cared. I came because I wanted to find men and bring them back from the edge of a dark place called sin and a destitute place called hell. John chapter 10 says that the hireling cares not for the sheep, but Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd. And the good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. Why would Jesus Christ go to Calvary and suffer and bleed and die? Why would he hang there for hours in agony upon that cross? Why would he pray, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do? Because he cares about the fragments. But Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Somewhere out there, beyond that door, somewhere in here, sitting in these pews, there's fragments. There's fragments. You look at your life and you say, Brother Gary, my life's a fragment. I can look at times and places in my life where it was broken. It was whole and complete and good, but something came along and now it seems like it's shattered. Seems like it's shattered into a million pieces. Let me say to you tonight that God cares about the fragments. God notices the fragments. God cares about the fragments. And then God gathers the fragments. He said to the disciples, he said, I want every piece, every morsel of bread, every morsel of fish, every piece, every broken piece, every fragment, I want it gathered up and collected and bring it to me. And they gathered up 12 baskets of fragments. God gathers the fragments. God is willing that all be used. God is willing that all be saved. God is willing that it all be gathered up, regardless of how broken or regardless of how small, that none be lost, he said. He cares about everyone. He cares about every piece. He cares about every broken home. He cares about every broken life. He cares about every broken spirit. He cares about every tear that you've cried. He cares about every problem and every care and every fear that you have. Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He doesn't say, Come unto me, all ye that are well known in the city and of great position and power and stature. He doesn't say, Come unto me, all ye that are super sanctified and righteous and holy. Come unto me, all ye great men. Come unto me, all ye mighty men. Come unto me, all ye well-known men. Come unto me, all ye super spiritual men. Come unto me, all ye that know the Bible. No. He says to ordinary people, everyday people like you and I, people that work every day, people that are heavy, people that are burdened down, people that are tired. You don't have to give rest to people that's not tired. He says, Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. He says this, I believe, to all the broken pieces. I was working at a job one time, and I was changing fluorescent light bulbs. They sent me up to the head man in the plant, the plant manager. And he was on his way to becoming the regional manager for the East Coast. But he was out of the office that day, and they said he's got a light in his office that's right above the desk, and it's flickering. And I said, oh, Lord. So I went in there, and his secretary let me and another boy in, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, you hold the ladder, and I'll go up there. And he said, all right. So I go up there, and it's a beautiful office with a beautiful mahogany desk with the inlay on the top of it, and all of his papers was laid out there. He used to work at McDonnell Douglas, and he had a model of a F-14 fighter jet there with some kind of award that he won sitting there on the desk. Everything is perfect. Everything is pretty. His day planners are laid out there. His beautiful leather office chair and all that's just right there. Just beautiful. I climbed up there and I pushed up the ceiling, and the ceiling was almost against the tin roof in the building. And I pushed this piece out of place, and I undid the clips on the light, and I pulled the cover down on the light just enough where I could get my hand up in there and pull this bulb out. Fluorescent bulb. Fluorescent bulbs are filled with a gas. They evacuate all the air out of them, and then they fill them with the gas, and it's got a filament inside there, and that's what makes the light go. So electricity energizes the thing and makes the light glow. But I pulled the thing out. It's one of them U-shaped bulbs, and I pulled it out, and for whatever reason, I don't know, when I just got it clear of the light, I dropped the thing. It landed right in the middle of his desk. I fumbled for it as it's falling, and I'm thinking to myself, Jesus, please, if you ever love me now, please. And I couldn't quite get my finger hooked around the thing, and it slipped through my grasp and hit the top of the desk and exploded into a billion bits. And I thought to myself, if I only had the power to gather up every fragment, because I just knew, it doesn't matter how much we cleaned or swept or vacuumed or anything. I just knew there was going to be a piece of glass left behind, and that man would find that piece of glass. And sure enough, about a week later, he called down and asked the maintenance supervisor, he said, can you explain to me why there's a piece of fluorescent glass inside my desk drawer? And he looked at me and I said, tell him it's because we forgot to suck it out of there. And I wish I could gather up those pieces. Let me tell you that God can. God can. God can gather up every piece of every broken heart, of every broken life, of every broken home, of every broken family. Jesus gathered up dust from the ground one day. He stooped down, gathered up dust. In the palm of his hand, he goes, you say, Brother Gary, how do you know that God went? Because you try to make enough spit without going to make a mud ball. And God made a mud ball, and he took the mud ball, and he said to the blind man, I'm going to put this on your eyes, and you wash it off, and you'll see. God can gather up dust and heal a blind man. What makes you think that he can't gather up the pieces of your life? The pieces of your life. The man that married me and my wife, my former pastor, not the one that I worked for, but the man that married me and my wife, he had a favorite verse in the book of Joel that he used to quote all the time. If I heard him quote it once, I heard him quote it 1,000 times. And in the book of Job, it says this, that which the palmer worm hath left, the locust hath eaten up. And that which the locust hath left, the cankerworm hath eaten up. And that which the cankerworm hath left, the caterpillar hath eaten up. And that's a prophecy that Joel gave to the nation of Israel, talking about the destitution and the place that they would come to where they had nothing. But then in the next chapter, in Job chapter 2, he says, but I can restore. He said, I can restore. God can restore. He can gather up the broken pieces. I'm thankful for a God that can gather up the broken pieces. Jesus gathered up a ragtag band of followers one day. Some of them fishermen, one of them was a lawyer, one of them was a tax collector, one of them was a thief and a betrayer. And he takes those 12 men and turns the world upside down. And they're still preaching about what he did to this day. They're still talking about what he did to this day. He gathered up 12 men and turned the world upside down. What makes you think that God can't gather the broken pieces of your life and do something with it? Maybe tonight your heart is in pieces. Maybe tonight your spirit is in pieces. Maybe tonight your hope is in pieces. Maybe tonight your faith is in pieces. I don't know. I don't know. But I know one that does know, and that's God. I know one that knows. I know one that cares. And I know one that can gather up the pieces, the broken pieces. He told the disciples, he said, gather it up. Gather it up that none be lost. Doesn't matter how big or how small you are tonight. Doesn't matter how broken it is tonight. Doesn't matter how hopeless it seems tonight. God can do it. God can.